지금부터 오프닝 세션 국제관계의 사회심리학적 접근을 시작하겠습니다. 오프닝 세션 좌장은 민병원 이화여대 교수님이십니다. 제1회의 시작을 부탁드립니다.
네, 지금부터 2020년 북한대학원대학교 SSK팀 남북한 한마음통합연구센터 국제학술회의를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 주제는 여러분들 들으셨다시피 인터코리아에서의 감정의 정치라고 하는 대단히 흥미로운 이 이슈라서 오늘 많은 기대가 되고 있습니다. 저는 사회를 맡은 이화여대 대학교 정치외교학과 교수 민병원입니다. 지금까지의 정치라고 하는 것은 대단히 어렵고 딱딱하고 해결하기 어려운 것이라고 다들 알고 있습니다. 특히 한반도 남북한 간의 관계라든가 동아시아 정치가 특히 그러하지 않나 싶은데요. 이런 부분에 대해서 아마 오늘 나오는 얘기들은 매우 새로운 이 관점들을 제시해주고 또 새로운 연구 어젠다가 될 수 있지 않을까 이렇게 기대를 해봅니다. 특히 오늘 발제를 해주실 홈즈 교수님께서는 이 분야에 새로운 이 프레임워크를 도입을 하시고 특히 이 비대면 이 코로나 위기 시대에 대면 외교를 강조를 하고 계셔서 매우 아이러니컬하지만 또 대단히 흥미로운 이 시기가 되지 않을까 이런 생각을 해보게 됩니다. 아무튼 오늘 학술회의를 진행하면서 남북한 문제를 포함한 여러 가지 현재의 현안에 중요한 또 새로운 돌파구가 마련되기를 기대를 해봅니다. 오늘 발표를 하실 마커스 홈즈 교수님과 또 토론자이신 은용수 교수님을 간략하게 먼저 소개를 드리고 시작을 하도록 하겠습니다. 마커스 홈즈 교수님은 현재 윌리엄 앤 메리 대학에서 가르치시고 계시고 개인적으로는 저와 직접 친분은 없지만 오하이오 스테이트 유니버시티 동문으로 알고 있습니다. 개인사는 나중에 따로 인사를 드리도록 하겠습니다. 홈즈 교수님은 특히 정치 심리학, 또 국제 안보, 국제 관계 이론, 외교 정책 등을 가르치고 계시고 또 연구를 많이 하셨습니다. 국제 기구, 그러니까 인터내셔널 오거니제이션이라든가 ISQ 같은 메이저 저널에 많은 글을 발표하셨고요. 특히 2018년에 발간하신 페이스 투 페이스 디플로머시라는 아주 흥미로운 국제 정치와 사회 심리학을 연결한 이 저술로 ISA 국제 관계 이 협회의 저술상을 획득하시기도 하셨습니다. 많은 이 관심들을 가지고 한번 지켜봐 주시기 바라겠고요. 토론자 선생님도 미리 간단히 소개를 드리면 은용수 교수님은 현재 한양대학교 정치외교학과 교수로 계시고 워릭대학에서 정치학 박사 학위를 받으셨습니다. 은 교수님은 오랫동안 국제정치와 국제정치 이론을 연구를 해오셨고 또 좀 개인적으로 같이 작업을 많이 했습니다만 우리나라에서 매우 드물게 이 감정의 국제정치를 연구를 해오신 분이라서 오늘 마침 홈즈 교수님의 발표에 아주 좋은 토론을 해주실 것으로 기대를 하고 있습니다. 오늘 저에게 주어진 시간이 대략 한 40분, 45분이 채 안 됩니다. 그래서 시간 관리를 이렇게 하겠습니다. 홈즈 교수님께서 여러분들 보시기 편하시게 비디오 촬영을 미리 해서 보내주셨기 때문에 그것을 먼저 시청을 하시고 대략 한 35분 정도 되는 것으로 추정이 되고 있습니다. 그리고 은 교수님의 토론을 대략 한 7, 8분 정도 10분 이내에서 해주시고 그러면 시간이 얼추 다 갈 것 같은데요. 온라인상이라서 에러가 있긴 하지만 혹시 발표를 들으시고 질문이 있으신 분들은 저희가 따로 취합을 해서 몇 분 더 사용을 하도록 하겠습니다. 그렇게 진행을 하고 일단 시간이 많지 않으니까 홈즈 교수님의 인사는 이따가 이 토론 과정에서 다시 부탁을 드리도록 하겠고 비디오를 바로 시작을 해주시기를 부탁드리겠습니다.
Hi, everybody. I'm Marcus Holmes, Associate Professor of Government here at William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, so not too far from South Korea. I want to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak today on inter-Korean relations. What I want to do is give a little bit of insight from a book that I recently published on face-to-face diplomacy, and specifically some of the social neuroscience behind face-to-face diplomacy. And what I'm going to do is basically just walk through the argument in the book relatively quickly, hopefully, and then we can talk about in the Q&A some examples and how we can apply it to the inter-Korean case, which I think is super fascinating and one I'm very much interested in. So one of the things to think about just right off the bat is we have an election coming up in the United States, you might have heard about, in 2 weeks. And one of the interesting things is that while Donald Trump has been, I think, very clear in his sort of how he looks at face-to-face diplomacy, and he's a big proponent of it, and I'm going to get into that in a second. Joe Biden actually, when he was vice president of the United States, was as well. So he also is somebody who has, over time, talked about the virtues of meeting personally with either friends or adversaries in order to develop relationships and develop understanding and build trust. And so I think regardless of who wins the election in a couple weeks, I think what we're going to see from the United States anyway is a continued sort of sense in which face-to-face diplomacy is very important. And most likely, depending on what's happening with COVID, obviously might change some of this, a lot of emphasis on face-to-face diplomacy. If Biden wins, I think especially to kind of rebuild some of the relationships that have been hurt over the last 4 years, basically. So, but just as a way of starting, I mean, I think it's one of the curious sort of natures of Donald Trump's presidency that he's been a huge proponent of face-to-face diplomacy, right? So, as we know, we had the meetings with Kim. He had the sort of infamous Helsinki summit with Putin. He's met with Trudeau a number of times, and this was one of those sort of awkward moments of the handshake. He had this sort of weird moment with Macron where he was, I guess, getting the dandruff off of his lapel there. But in any case, he's a big proponent of face-to-face diplomacy. And I think that's great for somebody who's just written a book about face-to-face diplomacy. But one of the interesting things about writing a book like this is that, when I was doing research for it and I was speaking with leaders and diplomats and, retired officials, a lot of them sort of looked at me like I was a little crazy in the sense that it was obvious to them that face-to-face diplomacy was important, right? And so what I want to do is actually start with 3 reasons why political scientists typically don't take face-to-face diplomacy all that seriously. And I think all of these are going to be familiar to you, but it's worth getting them on the table because this is the way that the book sort of operates, right? It's kind of trying to respond to these sort of 3 problems that people have raised, scholars have raised about face-to-face diplomacy. And those 3 problems are the problems of signaling, the origins of political interest, and future uncertainty. And so what I want to do is just highlight each of these very quickly with little vignettes about that sort of show what scholars are talking about when they think about face-to-face diplomacy. So the first one is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1945. At this point in his life, he's very sick. He's got all kinds of different physical problems. He hops on a boat, goes across the Atlantic Ocean, meets with Winston Churchill. They have a rendezvous. They then go to Yalta, where they meet with Joseph Stalin, and he is basically putting his life on the line to make this trip. And the reward for this meeting that he goes to with Stalin is, of course, basically that from the United States' perspective, Stalin lied, right? So on whether it's talking about Poland or other issues, basically Roosevelt came away from that meeting thinking that Stalin had sort of pledged he was going to do certain things and then didn't do them, right? And so what I think a lot of international relations scholars would point out is that Stalin was able to lie because at the end of the day, diplomacy is cheap talk, right? There's just nothing there to sort of back up what you say to somebody. And so for that reason, you can kind of tell somebody in one of these face-to-face meetings anything you want. And it doesn't really hold a lot of purpose because there's nothing to kind of keep to be sure that the person's intentions are actually what they say they are. And as we know, this can have devastating consequences, right? So when Neville Chamberlain goes and meets with Adolf Hitler and sort of, comes away with an impression that this guy can be trusted, that will have devastating effects for Europe and Britain in particular, right? So one of the things that happens here is that because you can lie, a lot of people look at these instances like this Munich moment and say, well, face-to-face diplomacy is kind of worthless, right? But it's also just not about lying. It can be difficult to convey sincerity. If we have time, I want to talk a little bit about the Reagan and Gorbachev case. But what's interesting is looking back on this now, both sides were trying to convey reassurance. Both sides were trying to tell the other that they had defensive intentions, and yet there's incentives for both sides to not believe the other, right? So the problem with signaling is that it's difficult to kind of convey sincerity, and it might be easy to lie. As such, I think what a lot of political scientists would say is that signaling intentions requires a cost, right? So you got to attach something to it. You know, if the United States is serious about its relationship with North Korea and wants to show that it has defensive intentions, it could remove some troops from South Korea, right? Now, I don't think that's a good idea, but it would certainly be a costly one. It would show, you know, arguably at least, that the United States is serious, right? So that's the idea here, is that diplomacy is ultimately cheap talk because signaling intentions requires cost. And I think more fundamental to even that is a basic problem, which is the nature of political interest, the nature of you know, whether it's North Korea's interest or the United States' interest or South Korea's interest. Those are in things like security. Those aren't things like power, right? And it's not obvious that diplomacy can really change any of those things or convince another state that their interests are not that, right? In other words, it's very hard to imagine what Trump could say to Kim, let's say, that would convince Kim that what his interests, he thinks his interests are, actually aren't those things, right? And it's very difficult to reassure a country, you know, like that, because you're basically trying to tell them that they have to reconsider what their interests are, or that you can tell them what their interests, you know, should be and how your interests are aligned, right? So it's a very difficult proposition. Now, nuclear weapons, on the other hand, give you both power and security, right? So political scientists would say, don't worry so much about diplomacy. Think about the actual weapons. Think about the material effects. The last thing I'll say here is that there's another problem, which is the future uncertainty issue, which is to say simply that even if you do get an agreement, even if you do have a good relationship with another person, even if you do have a sense in which I came to understanding and have empathy and trust, and we get an agreement, what today is a good agreement might not be a good agreement tomorrow, right? So what's a good idea today is not necessarily what's good for tomorrow. This is something that Gaddafi found out when he disarmed in 2003. You know, 8 years later, there's a Libya intervention by NATO, and he ends up, you know, dying, right? And so, you know, leaders look at these types of things and they say, I can never be sure what the future holds. So I can't trust what I'm told in these instances, right? I can't trust what's going to happen, not just because of the person I'm talking to today, but I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, 5 years in the future, 10 years in the future, 20 years in the future, right? So I think if you bring these all together, what they ultimately do is they kind of pose the sort of three horsemen that doom face-to-face diplomacy, right? Whether it's signaling, the origin of political interest, or future uncertainty, all of these things come together to basically, for many political scientists, mean that, you know, these are insurmountable problems, right? And diplomacy at best is probably irrelevant because it can't deal with these issues, but it's also at worst very dangerous, right? The Munich example, I think, is a great one, where if you get it wrong, you're in big trouble. This is one of the things that the people sort of criticized the Trump administration about when he was going to pursue these summits with Kim, which is to say, if this doesn't go well, if you can't do this right, or if you get the wrong read of Kim or whatever, you could have a disastrous outcome, right? It's sort of, you know, allegory to Munich and all these different, you know, sort of bad moments of history were coming up, right? Because these people were basically saying you can't trust what happens in these interactions, and if they go badly, you could be really, really much in trouble. Now, on the other hand, what's fascinating, though, is that whether it's, you know, Ambassador Johann von Twiss on his way to visit the Sultan of Biajpur in India 1637, or this wonderful relationship that we had between President Obama and Vladimir Putin, one of the fascinating things is that leaders and diplomats have traveled the globe, often at very considerable cost, in order to meet. Right? They've been doing this at least since the 14th century. I actually have some evidence that they you know, go back, you know, even before that. But basically, the idea of going and meeting with an adversary or a friend or whoever to sort of hash out an agreement has been going on for a very long time. And furthermore, they swear by the usefulness of these meetings, right? So if you go talk to leaders like I have, or you talk to diplomats or policymakers, they swear by the usefulness of the face-to-face meeting. And yet, scholars of international politics, scholars of world politics, political scientists have basically downplayed diplomacy's significance, right? So this actually creates a very simple puzzle, which is either leaders are incredibly naive and what they're doing just makes no difference and is actually dangerous, even though they say that it's not, or political scientists are wrong. Okay. Now, what I'm going to argue over the next few minutes is that political scientists are wrong, and I want to give you some specific reasons why that's the case, and then we can talk about maybe how you know this sort of theory then presents itself with respect to inter-Korean relationship. Okay, so here's the argument, just very, very briefly, that I'm going to develop, right? I think that the three horsemen that I just talked about, the three problems that doom diplomacy, boil down essentially to the problem of intentions, right? And what I'm going to argue is that face-to-face diplomacy facilitates intention transmittal with a fairly high degree of precision, okay? that there's actually a causal mechanism in the brain that we can see, that we can look to. We can sort of look at this brain architecture and make the case that this is a causal mechanism that helps people understand intentions. And furthermore, individuals do this when they sort of transmit information about their intentions to one another, even when they don't want to, right? So even in situations where you're trying to shield something, you're trying to be a little bit deceptive or hide something, you're giving off clues that actually give insights into your true intentions. And so there is evidence to suggest that you can pick up on some types of deception as well, right? Now, I don't want to make the strong claim that this is easy. It's certainly not. But it's something to take seriously in the sense that if there are clues to deception that you can gather in face-to-face interactions, and some people might be better than others at picking up on those clues, it nevertheless presents a sort of situation where there's information that's available to you that may not be available in other settings. And so what this means is that policymakers and diplomats are not naive to think that personal face-to-face meetings are crucial. They actually are correct. They just didn't have the knowledge from the neuroscience and psychology and stuff like that to make sense of why that would be the case. So here's what I want to do. I want to go over the problem of intentions very quickly, and then talk about, I think, which is the most interesting part for the audience here, which is, how you can overcome the problem of intentions with psychology and social neuroscience. And then if we have time, I want to talk about the Reagan-Gorbachev case a little bit. If we don't have time, then I will talk about that potentially in the Q&A. So I have my watch here, and I'm going to try to stop at about 35 minutes or so that we can have time to have a good discussion going forward. Okay. So I think the three horsemen that I mentioned before, problems of signaling, origins of political interest, and future uncertainty, are really a problem because of intentions, right? If you think about it, the problem with signaling is that it's just difficult to convey sincere intentions and easy to convey deceptive ones. Or if you think about the origins of political interest, right? Intentions are not coming from or changed through diplomacy, right? They come from other things. They come from just, the nature of states in the international system. And future uncertainty means that intentions can change, or the people with particular intentions can change, and therefore they're changeable. They don't last forever, right? And I think fundamentally this goes back to this sort of age-old problem, which realists have pointed out very early on, which is that intentions are just difficult to understand, right? If there's a core problem in international politics, the intentions issue might be exactly what it is. Now, scholars have come up with different solutions to this, right? So we talked about costly signaling. You can reduce the number of weapons you have. You can sort of do something that attaches a cost to your intention. That might help. We also have things like reputation, so you can work through the United Nations or an institution. Socialization, maybe you can socialize, a quote-unquote bad apple into being a good apple, being a part of the sort of liberal international order. But all of these efforts, I think, at the end of the day, kind of rely on theorizing and approximating the intentions of others, which is to say, they're all about sort of trying to deduce what's going on in the head of leaders in these countries. And they're not direct access, right? They're all sort of theory based. So for example, costly signaling is a theory, right? It's a theory that says that as the costs go up, right? If a cost is important to a state, then we can assume that cost means that they're being serious, right? That they have a particular intention. But it's not because we know their intention that we have this sense, right? We're theorizing it. We're just sort of coming up with as a way of approximating what it is, theorizing what it might be. And this is because we can't ever really know the intentions of others. Now, why can't we know the intentions of others? Well, I think ultimately this problem is really a larger sort of philosophical issue with the problem of other minds, right? And the problem of other minds is just very simply that intentions are beliefs that exist in people's heads, right? There are beliefs that exist not in nuclear weapons, not in GDP, but in the heads of leaders, right? So if I want to ask the question, why does the DPRK want nuclear weapons? There are a few people in that country that have the answer to that, right? Because those are beliefs that exist inside the minds of human beings that are behind the skull, in their brain somewhere, and we just can't read that, right? We're not mind readers. And so we can't sit down with Kim and say, according to this logic, why do you want a nuclear weapon? What is this all about? Why do you need this weapon, right? We don't know if it's for offense or defense, right? So part of this is all about the idea that you can't read other minds, and because you can't read what's going on in people's minds, you'll never know for sure what their intentions actually are, right? Now, this is where the book sort of begins, which is to say that, there's a lot of evidence actually from psychology and neuroscience that have begun to problematize some of these core assumptions, right? That it turns out that we do have access to the minds of other people, and we do it every day, right? We have empathy with other people. We come to understanding with other people. And indeed, social interaction would be very difficult if we didn't have this understanding, right? If we weren't able to kind of develop a sense of what other people are thinking, it'd be awfully difficult to get on life, right? So this has to be overstated, right? And this perspective, I think, comes out of the last, 50, 60, 70 years of psychology and sociology research, right? Now, I'm not going to go through, decades worth of research here, but I just want to hit some of the highlights. 1950s through the 1960s and 70s, you started to see a number of different come out about how emotional expression and nonverbal communication reveal a lot about your mental states, right? This is where you get these studies that sort of talk about expressive behavior, and they talk about how you can sort of emote and give through your mannerisms a sense of what you're thinking, how energized you are, and so on and so forth. Then in the 1980s and the 1990s, business administration, economics, they get wind of this and they sort of start to think about, okay, what might this mean for business relationships? What might this mean for negotiations? And they start to do a number of important experiments. Some of those experiments looked at face-to-face interaction and the prospects for trust building, for intention prediction. Turned out that in both instances, that the more face-to-face interactions you have relative to other types of interactions, let's say over the phone or back-to-back or something like that, you get better trust building and intention prediction. You also get better deception detection in face-to-face interaction, right? Now, they were applying it to business deals and to negotiation, but it's one of these findings that comes out of psychology that can be broadly applied. And then in the 2000s and the 2010s and these early 2020s, I think what we start to see is the importance of subconscious automatic processing, right? So this is where you get sort of Daniel Kahneman's type of stuff. If you've seen, or read Thinking Fast and Slow, this is a sort of discussion about system 1 and system 2. System 1 is the fast kind of automatic system. System 2 is the slow reflective system. And his whole point is that we spend most of our lives in system 1. Why? Well, metabolically, it's cheaper. It's easier just to have shortcuts going on in your head. If you had to think about everything all the time, it'd be very difficult to get on through life. And so for that reason, a lot of the decisions and thoughts that we have are basically subconscious automatic things that we don't even think about, right? The last piece here is there's also studies that show mimicry or automatic mimicry in face-to-face interactions, which is to say, when you're having interaction with somebody, you tend to mimic their sort of expressive behaviors, meaning that you're on sort of the same wavelength a lot of the time, right? It's subconscious, you don't know you're doing it, but you're sort of finding yourself mimicking what the other person is doing, and that in some instances increases likability and can be an important finding, right? But the main thing I want to talk about today with respect to the evidence is actually about a discrete set of neurons, which I think is fascinating, right? Now, this goes back to the 1990s. And what happened was it was actually a discovery by mistake, right? So at the University of Parma, Giacomo Rizzolatti was doing research on the motor function of monkeys, right? And so basically what he did was he had a monkey in an fMRI machine, which is a way to measure the blood flow in the brain. And he had the monkey reach out to grab a banana. Okay, that was what he was looking to sort of understand, right? When the monkey reaches out to grab a banana, what lights up on the fMRI? What part of the brain is coding that motor action? And he did that experiment and he wrote down, what the answer was and did it a bunch of times and got like, okay, here's the motor region for grabbing a banana. At the end of the experiment, the researcher reached out to grab the banana from the monkey, and it turned out that what happened was the fMRI was lighting up in the same exact spot. So he's like, well, that's strange. That shouldn't happen. And he did it over and over again. He cleaned the electrodes. He rebooted the computer, all the stuff that you would do, to figure out what's going on. And it turned out that what was happening was when the monkey did an action, monkey grabs a banana, or the monkey saw a researcher reach out to grab the banana, the same neurons were firing. And subsequent theorizing about this and sort of looking at it empirically suggested that what's actually happening is the same neurons are firing when the monkey observes something happening and when the monkey does something for itself. So acting and observing are the same thing. And the reason why this is the same thing, the reason we have this is that one of the ways we understand what's happening with other entities, other monkeys in this case, is by simulating that action for ourselves, right? So we understand what grabbing a banana is like because in our brain, we go through the process of grabbing the banana. That's how we know what that action actually is, okay? Now, one of the things that's really interesting here is that this means that, these neurons are essentially simulating action, right? They're simulating what's going on when it sees something happen. It's not like they're going and actually doing the movement. If I see somebody reach out and grab a banana, I don't physically reach out and grab a banana. I just simulate that for myself in my head, right? And so what they wanted to know was, okay, well, how does this work? Like, is it simulating all types of action? Is it just simulating particular types of action? And it turns out that these neurons are sort of linked to the idea of intentional action, right? And a series of experiments kind of shows how this works, right? So in slide 1 up here, right, what they did was they showed the monkey that there's a box, and they had the human hand reach out to grab a box. Now, because that action is specifically intentional, right? There's a very specific intention to reach out and grab the box. The neurons fired, right? They fired a lot. In slide 2, they showed the monkey that there's no box there. The hand reached out to grab no box. There's no real specific intentional action there, and therefore you see far less firing of the mirror neurons, okay? Number 3, what they did was they showed the monkey that there's a box. They put a screen over the box. So the monkey couldn't see the box, but it knew it was there because they had seen it previously. And then they have the hand reach out behind the screen to grab the box. The monkey knows that the box is there. It can't see it happening, but it knows what's happening because it has seen that box there previously. And it knows that there's a specific intention to grab that box. The mirror neurons fire again. Right? And number 4, what happens is they show the monkey that there's no box. They put the screen over no box. The human hand goes behind the screen, grabs nothing. They don't fire. Right? So in other words, what's happening here? These mirror neurons are literally mirroring what's going on in one's head from what's going on in somebody else's action. Right? So in other words, I see an action, I mirror it for myself in my brain. That's how I come to understand it. Right? And what's important about this is that they're very specifically linked to intention, right? Intentional action is what causes these things to fire. They're not firing just for any old action. They're not firing just because of something, that you're doing with your hand. It doesn't make any sense, right? They're firing because of specific intentions, okay? Now, subsequently, what folks have looked at with respect to human beings is that these are linked very much to both overt facial expressions, but also micro expressions, right? So the way to understand this is that when I look at a face, like a surprise face or a fear face or a sad face, I don't theorize what that face is telling me, right? I know. I look at it, I know. How do I know? Well, the reason I know is that what's happening is that I'm simulating for myself what that facial expression is with the mirror neuron, and that is going through the brain and telling me at a very sort of personal, affective level, like feeling, right, what is happening, right? So in other words, I'm simulating the expression for myself. I'm feeling that emotion at some level through that simulation, and that's how I know what it is. I don't have to theorize about it because I'm simulating for myself. I know what it is because I'm feeling it for myself, right? And so this is a distinction that's really important because it means that at least for some of these types of activities, you're able to do this without even thinking about it. That your brain is working subconsciously to give you an understanding of what's going on in a social interaction with somebody else, and that's happening without you even having to process it consciously in a system 2 type of way. The other thing that these are useful for, and this is what I was saying a second ago with micro expressions, is the idea of picking up on very subtle changes in the human face that reveal something about them that aren't obvious, right? So let me give you just a couple examples. This is a low trusting face, medium trusting face, highly trusting face. This is a low threatening face, medium threatening face, high threatening face. Less threatening on the left, more threatening on the right. Less threatening on the left, more threatening on the right. And what you'll notice is the changes here are incredibly subtle, right? It's sort of how the nose hangs a little bit. It's where the eyes are. It's how the ears look. It's where the face, the lips and the face are. Very subtle micro types of changes that are very difficult to pick up in any given instance, but you're noticing subconsciously, right? You're continually getting a sense of what's going on with the other person because of their expressive behavior, the micro type of expressions that they're giving off that you're understanding at a subconscious level without even processing them. Okay, now I mentioned before deception, right? And again, I don't want to imply that deception is easy. If deception was easy, you wouldn't be able to play poker. Lots of things would be difficult if deception was easy. So it's not easy, right? But let me give you just one very short little experiment that shows you how this works and how there are clues to deception that you can pick up on in these face-to-face interactions. Okay, so first of all, what they did in this experiment was they had a confederate, meaning the woman in this series of pictures, it's actually a movie, is in on the experiment. And in one condition, what they do is they have a box that's actually heavy, right? And they have the woman to go and pick up the box, and it's heavy, right? In the other condition, the box is not heavy, the box is empty, but they tell the woman, act like it's a really heavy box, right? So pick it up like it was heavy. And then what they do with the subjects in the experiments, they ask them after seeing this video for 3.5 seconds, was that a real heavy box or was that a faked heavy box? And it turns out that people are able to, above chance, get it right? That they're able to say that was a real heavy box or that was a faked heavy box, right? Now, the question is why? If you ask these people afterwards, you say, well, why did you know that box wasn't really heavy? They'll say things like, well, it didn't seem right to me. Something was off, right? In other words, things are happening that you're processing in the nonverbal sort of expressive expressive behavior forum, and you're getting information about that. You're inferring deceit from people without being able to consciously say why you have come to that realization, right? So in other words, what's happening is that people are making sort of assessments about other people through their expressive behaviors, and not able to actually articulate exactly what it is that's giving them that information. The emotional expression, the micro expression, the subtle change in body behavior, all that kind of thing is providing clues for people that give you a better sense of whether somebody's being deceitful. Now, I mentioned it's hard to do this, and it's true it's hard. Some things make it easier, right? So people who are higher on emotional intelligence, the sort of scale of how well you're able to sort of understand the emotions of others. People who are higher in self-monitoring, a scale of basically how much you pay attention to the sort of, sense in which you're giving off at any moment of time, right? Those are linked to better deception detection, right? So those types of people are better able to pick it up. The interesting one is narcissism is inversely correlated with it, right? So narcissists, it turns out, are less likely to be able to pick up on deception, okay? That's, I think, a fascinating finding that we can talk about maybe in the Q&A and how to apply that in particular cases. Okay, so let's take a second here and kind of take a stock of where we're at, right? I think all of this kind of suggests a couple of different things. The first is that it suggests a type of social theory that comes through, with this evidence from the brain about experiential simulation of observed specific intentional behavior, right? In other words, we come to understand other people by simulating for ourselves what is going on with them. That's how we understand them, whether it's from a facial expression, a micro expression, bending over to pick up a box. This is all about sort of you understanding another person through your own kind of experience. Now, I know what many of you are probably thinking, which is to say, Professor Holmes, it's one thing to grab a banana. It's one thing to pick up a box. It might be one thing to have a sort of threatening face, from time to time. But this is all sort of like action type of stuff, right? This is about like the actual physical stuff, not in an intention of invading another country or an intention to have a particular nuclear weapon, right? And I agree with that, of course. The thing is that what this sort of new social theory is suggesting is that the mirroring is not just involved in this automatic type stuff. It's also involved in reflective thought as well, which is to say they've done a series of experiments where you measure the person's ability or how many mirror neurons they have, their sort of empathy networks and so on and so forth. And the more empathic response that you have, the more mirroring you have, the more activity in that region of the brain also predicts things like your overall levels of empathy, right? So in other words, that's empathy on social things as well. It's like how much money to give people, for example. They do these games like dictator games and things like that, right? So that's one argument. But the other more basic argument, so that would be an argument that this is involved in sort of like the higher level thought processing as well. Another argument, though, is that abstract intentions, if you think about what they are, like a decision to invade a country or a decision to what I'm going to have for dinner tonight, right, can be thought of as a series of motor actions, right? So another way of thinking about it is, intentions at the end of the day are motor, right? They're action and based, right? And intention is an intention to do something. There's a sort of, action component to all of this, right? So a lot of scholars point out that, like, actually, while these sort of mirror neurons might be sort of based in these sort of automatic pre-reflective kinds of activities, those are feeding the very sort of abstract thoughts that we have, right? Those are feeding into the way that we understand, somebody's intentions to go to a store or to invade a country or whatever the case might be, right? So in other words, mirroring is involved in complex reflective thought as much as it is involved in the automatic thought as well. And I think what this suggests is that, as mentioned, there's these two systems that people like Daniel Kahneman have, and that's a nice metaphor, but I think it might be a little bit misleading in this case, right? These bottom-up processes, the mirroring, the automatic stuff, the sort of pre-reflective activity is feeding into these higher-level thought processes, just like the higher-level thought processes are feeding into our automatic intuitions in the senses that we have and so on and so forth, right? So in other words, we can't think about these, I think, as discretely two different systems, but rather I think we should think about them as sort of both interacting and sort of creating these higher level thought processes in a sort of feedback loop, almost like, right? So instead of two systems, how about one system where we have two sort of ways of describing the types of activity that are happening. So you bring all this together and you get a couple of different ways to go, right? Proponents of this type of social theory suggest that what we eventually get to, if you sort of dig deep into this, is a shared circuit model of social interaction, which is to say, we've all kind of had that sort of, being on the same wavelength type of expression, like we're all, we're in this together in the sense that we kind of understand what the other person is thinking and stuff like that, that this model does suggest something along those lines, right? That we do through simulation and experience, kind of come to understand another person and get on that same page and sort of be connected to them, right? Now, it's a connection that's happening simultaneously in my brain and your brain. So it's not like a literal connection, but it's like what's going on in my head is going on in yours, right? And that's how we understand others, right? So this is not about theorizing. This is not about approximation. This is not about thinking about what the other side is doing. This is an automatic type of processing, right? It also implies that we can get to intentions through the first person experience. I know your intentions because I'm simulating them for myself, right? And that's an interesting way of thinking about it because it's no longer about the third person, right? It's no longer sort of me thinking about you, like, and what's going on with you. I come to know what you're doing through me. Now, some people take this very far, right? So some people say, look, this provides a unifying framework for all of the things that we've been talking about over the last 60, 70 years about emotional expression and nonverbal behavior and all that kind of stuff. And Marco Iacoboni is one of the leaders in this type of work, says the problem of other minds is not a problem. Now, I don't know, if you want to necessarily go that far with this and say that the problem with their minds is not a problem, but you can see where he's coming from, right? And where he's coming from is, if we can understand what's going on in the minds of other people through these neurons, then the problem with their minds is severely undercut, right? It might not go away completely because you're never 100% sure what they're thinking. Intentions are never 100% certain. But if you have a sense of what's going on in another person's head, that is kind of getting around this problem of other minds. Let me just, before I end and we start the discussion, give you a couple different reasons why some people are skeptical. And indeed, you should be kind of skeptical of some of these findings, right? The first is that the meaning of neurons firing is not clear, right? At the end of the day, intention is a philosophical concept. I was making the claim that, intentions can be thought of as motor, and that's true. But there is simply a sort of philosophical problem here, which is that intention also, when it comes to political intention, encapsulates more, right? It's not just action. It's just not, sort of I intend to have a nuclear weapon for this reason. Is not simply action, it seems to me, right? So there's other things that are wrapped into that we can talk about in the Q&A. These things are also difficult to analyze in humans, right? So what you really want to be able to do is insert a recording device into a particular cell in the brain. That's really difficult to do with human beings, obviously. So most of the experiments are done with other animals like monkeys, right? And so a lot of people say, look, we got to learn more about these things. And I completely agree, right? That leads us to number 3, which is that the science is still young. It might be that a lot of this changes over time and our understanding of this gets refined. And I think that's fine, right? I think that's the way science is supposed to work. We refine our understanding over time and you make changes to your theories based on that, right? So that doesn't really seem to be a big problem, but that is something to keep in mind when we talk about how you can apply this to modern day international politics. So what do I do with all this? Well, I think that the way to use this evidence is to not try to reduce everything to chemicals or neurons, right? I'm not trying to sort of say like the brain explains everything that's going on here, right? But rather, I think what it can do is it can help us to problematize existing theory, right? So I started with those 3 horsemen, the 3 problems: the signaling, future uncertainty, origins of political interest. If it's true that we can get around those problems by stipulating a new theory, right? So in other words, we don't need costly signaling to know intentions, but rather we just need face-to-face interaction to know intention, then I think that actually has a lot to do with what's going on here, right? I think you could actually say, okay, I have the existing theory is wrong. I have a new theory about how this is going to work, and I'm going to explain to you how that works in particular cases, right? Okay. Now, I think what I'm going to do here is stop because I'm at 33 minutes and I want to make sure that we have time for a discussion. I'm happy to talk about an empirical example. The best one for me is Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, because it's in that example that I think you see, both sides really come to understand each other's intentions in these summits, right? In 1983, Ronald Reagan's calling the Soviet Union the evil empire. By 1988, in their 4th summit, he's calling the Soviet Union a partner in peace, right? So that's a remarkable change in a very short period of time. There's obviously lots going on there, but I think that what happens first in Geneva and then Reykjavik is they come to understand better what each side is thinking, and it happens through face-to-face interaction. And crucially, it happens based on the specific intention of what the other is saying. The one quote I will leave you with here, because I think it's really important, is that, you know, Gorbachev on the opening day of their meeting in Geneva said, you know, Mr. President, I don't agree with you on a bunch of different things, right, including the idea of being able to distinguish offensive and defensive weapons, but I can see that you really mean what you say, right? In other words, what Gorbachev is saying to Reagan is essentially that, like, I can see when you talk to me, I can see your sincerity. I can see that when you say you want these weapons to be able to have them for defensive purposes, that you're being sincere. And he got that because of that face-to-face interaction of a specific intention about those weapons, and I think that's crucial, right? And so this is just a very short, you know, sort of way of illustrating the argument, but you know, clearly this can apply to the inter-Korean case quite well, and I think it actually does apply in some way to with the Trump-Kim summits too. A lot of people look at those as big failures. You know, I was actually one of the few people, at least in the United States, I was very excited about this because I was thinking about the prospect of you know, engendering better cooperation and potentially trust and empathy in these summits. You know, I think it's still in progress. We don't know exactly how this is all going to play out. But I am optimistic for the future, and that the continuation of these summits, if Biden wins, they'll say, you know, he's ahead in the polls now, so it looks like he has a good chance of winning. But if he does win and he wants to continue where Trump has sort of tried to create a relationship, I would be in favor of that. I don't think he necessarily will, for reasons we can discuss, but I would be very much in favor of him doing that. So in any event, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing right now. I want to thank you guys again for inviting me, and thank you for allowing me to speak to you today. If you have questions, I would be happy to have a conversation with you about them, and curious to get your thoughts. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다, 홈즈 교수님. 사회심리학과 신경과학에 걸쳐서 최근 연구 동향들을 아주 많은 내용들을 압축해서 전달을 해주셨습니다. 저희가 시간이 많지는 않은데요. 은영수 교수님께서 그래도 이 많은 여러 가지 이슈들이 어떤 의미를 갖는지, 또 어떻게 활용할 수 있는지에 대해서 코멘트를 토론을 해주시도록 하시겠습니다. 은 교수님.
Okay, thank you, Professor Min, for your very generous introductions. So, do you hear me okay? 잘 들리시죠? Okay. Thank you, Marcus, for your very interesting and insightful talk. Okay, it is my great pleasure and honor, to be honest, to have this chance to talk to you and understand your work better. When your book Face-to-Face Diplomacy came out about 2 years ago, I was happily surprised and enlightened by reading it, of course. I think you did lay groundwork for a truly interdisciplinary approach to international studies, as well as for rethinking how we IR scholars understand intentions and approach the issue of intention. Especially given the fact that we are living in very parochial, or I would say one-dimensional terrain of the debate on intention in IR, where the roles of face-to-face diplomacies are largely downplayed because of the problem of uncertainty about intention. So I think you did a fantastic job to offer us alternative thinking and convincing approach to the issue of intention. So I do agree with you that our conventional wisdom or mainstream understanding in IR underestimates humans' natural ability to read others' mind. And as you pointed out, there is a great deal of evidence from neuroscience that demonstrates that we human beings have a system of mirror neurons that enables us to simulate the mental states, that is, intentions of others in face-to-face interactions. And the implications we can draw from this scientific evidence are then very clear and important. As you know, we need to rethink, or even, I'd say, reground many of the IR theories and propositions in which the roles of face-to-face diplomacy and meetings are downplayed. Having said all of this, I've got, of course, some questions for you, just to help me, or hopefully help us, to gain more clarity. Okay. First of all, although we human beings have innate ability to read others' intentions in face-to-face settings, I wonder if I could take this as an indication that our actions will be sort of a follow-up to our intentions and mental readings. In other words, even if we are born with incredible ability to read others' mind, I'm not quite sure, as you just pointed out, if our actions or choices will be necessarily reflect and represent our intentions. Rather, I think to read others' intention is one thing, but to take actions, what kinds of action we're going to take toward each other, it could be quite different, right? At the end of the day, humans do not make decisions or take actions in a vacuum, but rather in pre-existing conditions, be they material, ideational, or emotional. And what is more, we humans are social beings, right, whose perceptions and judgments are made within certain social environments. Therefore, our choices and actions will be influenced and even constrained by these socially and historically constructed ideas, including the identity of the society where we live. And what this could mean, I think, is that although we human beings have natural ability to read each other's intentions, our final actions toward each other could be different from our intentions. If so, the enduring problem of distrust and security dilemma will persist in international relations, precisely because even if we understand what others intend to do, we cannot be certain about whether or not they will act according to their intentions. This is not just about the problem that intention can change over time in different situations, but even if intentions remain unchanged over time, the problem of intention-action dissonance still remains, right? So I wonder what you think about this possible discrepancy between intention and action. And this brings me to my second question, which is about the issue of causality in the empirical cases of face-to-face diplomacy. You very nicely introduced us the cases of successful and unsuccessful face-to-face diplomacy in today's presentations and in your book, right? Including the meetings between Reagan and Gorbachev near the end of Cold War, and of course the notorious Munich talks in 1938. And although very interesting and very suggestive, I still wonder if these cases, their successes or failures can be explained solely in terms of our successes or failures in reading others' intentions. In other words, in order to determine causality or discern causal mechanisms through which these cases occur, it seems to me we need more integrative or more nuanced approach that is attentive not only to settings of face-to-face interactions or dispositional characteristics of human individuals involved in these face-to-face interactions, but also to broader external conditions and then impinge upon and influence our intention reading processes. For example, I wonder if or to what extent where and when face-to-face diplomacy takes place do matter for the success or the failure of intention understanding. And what about intention understanding in multilateral as opposed to bilateral face-to-face settings? Or regardless of this temporal, spatial, or situational dimension, other IL scholars, especially constructivists, might wonder how much socially constructed categories such as gender or race do influence our natural ability to read others' mind, which is the key to the success of face-to-face diplomacy. So in a way, I think this question has to do with the scope condition of your thesis, right? Under what conditions or under what circumstances intention understanding and therefore face-to-face diplomacy are most likely to work? Or by contrast, are there any particular circumstances where I'd call selective intention understanding, or I'd call biased simulation of others' mental states are likely to take place? Okay. And third and related question that I have for you is that how successful do you think the face-to-face meetings between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump would be in terms of eventually reaching an agreement between the two? And is that agreement, if any, going to be a good thing? And like you said in your book and in today's presentation briefly, if someone has narcissism, they tend to overestimate their ability to read others and therefore can fail to have accurate reading of others' intentions, right? And this is exactly what happened to the Munich talk, where Chamberlain failed to read Adolf Hitler's intentions. And it seems very clear that Donald Trump has narcissism with a big ego. So what do you make of the, their face-to-face interactions? And should we welcome them, even if there is a clear possibility that Donald Trump, who has big ego and narcissism, could misread Kim Jong-un's intentions? And if still we need to welcome the face-to-face interactions between the two, how could we avoid a possible reproducing of the pitfalls of the Munich agreement in the case of talks between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, okay? And my final question is related to the moral or normative dimension of intention understanding. You explained to us we human beings can read and understand each other's intentions by simulating each other's mental states. It is like a form of empathy, you said, right? But if I'm not mistaken, empathy does not necessarily help us, our world, move toward more humane and normatively desirable ends. Of course, our conventional wisdom tells us empathy for other people is a good thing. You know, what harm could from understanding other or feeling the feelings of other people? But it is not necessarily a force for good. Rather, it could be a force for bad or even evil as well. For example, I, as a human, tend to better understand other people and feeling a stronger sense of solidarity with them if he or she is a member of the same group that I belong to, right? There are a bunch of the evidence from cognitive science that demonstrate this biased cognitive tendency, right? And this cognitive tendency can be a source of course, the act of discrimination and exclusion. And in fact, the 2016 book written by Paul Bloom called Against Empathy demonstrates that empathy is one of the leading motivators for inequality and immorality in society. Far from helping us to improve the lives of others, empathy is irrational emotion that appeals to our very narrow prejudices. And if so, our natural ability to read others' mind is not necessarily a good thing from a moral perspective, right? So my point here is that we got to pay more attention. We got to pay greater attention to this moral dimension or normative perspective of intention understanding, asking ourselves questions like, whose intention do we understand and have empathy with, for what purposes? So in your book or presentation, this question seems to me kind of missing. So would you? It'd be great if you could share your thoughts on this issue as well. And once again, thank you very much for your great work, from which I've learned immensely. Okay, so thank you.
네, 은 교수님 감사합니다. 저희가 은 교수님께서 여러 가지 이론적인 또 응용과 관련된 질문을 해주셨는데요. 저희가 다음 세션이 또 예정이 되어 있어서 굉장히 타임 압박을 받고 있습니다. 그래서 홈즈 교수님께 부탁을 드리는데 가급적 3, 4분 안에 지금 나온 여러 가지 질문들을 압축적으로 간략하게 답변을 해주시면 고맙겠습니다.
Okay. I cannot promise that. I will try to do my best. So first of all, thank you once again for having me. This is a pleasure to be able to speak to you. It's also a pleasure to speak to an audience that has engaged so deeply with my work. And so that's extremely nice for me to be here. These questions you gave me were probably some of the toughest I've ever received, and things that I've also thought a lot about. So that's good. I can't do everything in 3 minutes, but let me just give you a couple of different responses. So I think your very first point is a crucial one, which is the way I would interpret what you're saying is that there's a distinction to be made between two individuals, even if they're leaders, even if they're heads of state, coming to an understanding about what that other person intends or what that other person's view is. There's a distinction between that and what I would call sort of state action, right? So one of the things that happens with Reagan and Gorbachev, for example, is Reagan goes over and has these meetings with Gorbachev, and he goes back to Washington, D.C., and the people in Washington, D.C. say, you crazy? You're telling me you want to change U.S. policy based on a feeling that you received by talking to Gorbachev? They thought he was nuts. You know, and so I think that's an indication of the problem, which is that whatever is happening at a human level between two people ultimately is between them. And they are part of a larger state apparatus that will determine state action and what the intentions of the state are, but they're not the only part. And so one of the things that I need to do in my next book, and it's actually one of the things that I am trying to do in this book that I'm writing now, is figure out how we move from that dyadic interaction between two people and aggregate it up to higher levels of analysis. And so the thought here is simply that if I can engender understanding with you personally, that's a good starting point. But that, as you point out, doesn't get us all the way there. To get us all the way there, I also have to convince the people in my bureaucracy, the people in my subcultures that are predisposed to not want to trust the other side, that they should see the world from my perspective and understand what I'm saying about this other side as well. So I grant you 100% that is a very big problem. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to solve it, but it's something that I'm looking at. As a part of that book that I'm writing right now, I'm also trying to address your second and third points, which really are, you know, these face-to-face diplomacy meetings don't happen in a vacuum. People have to make decisions to go pursue face-to-face diplomacy. And we know over time that there's been variation in U.S. administrations and their approach to North Korea, U.S. administrations and their approach to the Soviet Union in the Cold War. There's a lot of variation that needs to be explained. So the book that I just talked to you guys about kind of starts with the premise of we're in the room, we're having an interaction. But there's this whole host of activity that takes place, you know, historically, culturally, society-wise, that get us into a place where we can have that meeting in the first place or not have that meeting. And so I think one of the critiques that you raised about my book, and it's absolutely correct, is that I don't really deal with that question of how do we get in the room in the first place? Like what needs to happen? Because that might imply something about the relationship between the two states to begin with, right? You get these summits and you get these moments where people can meet when they're ready to have a summit and when they're ready to meet. And so I need to do a more to kind of think through exactly what that process looks like. The other thing I need to work through is my book is all men. Right now, the first book, I want to look at cases that involve variation in race, variation in gender. This is an area that I haven't done yet, and I certainly need to do because that's part of international politics, clearly. Two other last points. So I would say, so I think the way to understand empathy is that empathy by itself, you're right, doesn't give us a moral good or a moral bad. Empathy can be used to destroy the other side. I mean, you know, you need empathy to play chess well, right? I need to be able to understand what you're thinking, your perspective, try to predict what you're going to do. And I can use that to beat you in chess. I can use that to dominate you. I can use that to try to destroy you. So certainly empathy alone doesn't get us there. The problem is that in order to get to trust, I feel like we need empathy first, right? So we're never going to get to the point where we can trust one another unless we understand what the other side is thinking, we understand what their intentions are and so forth, right? So empathy, it's almost like it gets you to a point where it can go two different ways. It gets you to the point where we have a better understanding of the other side. That's good if our aims are good. That's good if we're being good moral people. But it can also go poorly. It can go in the other direction. And so what I want to focus on in my future work is trying to understand those moments where we get empathy and then why sometimes we go in this direction and then sometimes we go in that direction. Because you're right. I mean, it's empathy alone is not going to do it. And I think Paul Bloom's book is right on point there. In the 1 minute that I have remaining, let me try to address the Trump and Kim summits. My feeling about building a relationship there was that this was something that needed to happen. If you recall what was going on with the tweets and the rhetoric and the language and just all of the sort of threats that were being made, I was very nervous about this, right? And so I feel like the idea of building a relationship and trying to understand what Kim might be sort of thinking is a very good one. I think you are absolutely right that unfortunately it was President Trump that was the one that went over to make the visit, precisely because I think you're right. I think he probably is fairly high in narcissism. Now I'm not a psychiatrist. You can't do this type of thing where you look from afar and diagnose somebody. But I think it's clear that there are at least some elements of narcissism there, which would imply that he would have a harder time, as my book suggests, getting a read on Kim. And so for that reason, I was a little skeptical that it was going to work in the end, but I was still happy that they were going to try to build a relationship. Mm-hmm. The one missing piece, though, and this is I think the important point that came out of the Cold War case, they went into Geneva, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, with very limited aims. The idea wasn't to create a deal. The idea wasn't to solve every issue. They just wanted to go and start to resolve some of the suspicions that both sides had about one another. These summits, unfortunately, were set up before Trump even left the United States as, I'm going to get them to agree to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We're gonna figure this out. Where everything's going to be done. I'm going to get the deal. I think the expectations were too high. So in addition to all the other problems, the narcissism and things like that, I wish they would have adopted more of a Geneva model where they would say, let's just talk. Let's start working on this slowly, piece by piece. Let's not go for the end deal right now. Let's just start to build something. And if they had done that, then maybe things would have been a little bit different. So I think that's ultimately why it didn't work out with Trump. I am hopeful, though, if Biden wins, that he will try to continue the relationship. The problem he's going to have, though, by the way, is he's going to try to be the anti-Trump. Trump has sort of cozied up to people that the United States has traditionally viewed as sort of the enemy. Biden is not going to want to follow in those same footsteps. So I think that'll be a little bit of a problem for him. Anyway, I'm over my time. Thank you so much. Those are fantastic comments. Exactly the types of comments that are well thought out and show that you really engage with the material. So thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다, 홈즈 교수님. 저희가 플로에서도 질문을 좀 받으려고 했는데 시간이 많이 돼서 사회자 직권으로 건너뛰도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 마커스 교수, 홈즈 교수님께서 던져준 많은 개념들과 이론적인 프레임워크들이 오늘 전체 컨퍼런스의 대주제인 이 남북한 관계에도 많은 시사점을 던져줄 것으로 생각하고요. 또 이어지는 세션에서도 지속적으로 활용이 되지 않을까 싶습니다. 마무리를 짓고자 하는데요. 오늘 코로나 덕분으로 이렇게 저희가 온라인상에서 다소 불편하고 어색하게 모이긴 했습니다만 이 홈즈 교수님의 굉장히 흥미로운 여러 가지 접근 방법들이 오늘날 한반도 그리고 동북아시아의 국제 관계에 이해를 하는데 많은 도움이 되기를 기대하면서 또 다음번에 또 좋은 기회를 갖도록 그렇게 약속을 드리겠습니다. 오늘 이 오프닝 세션에 아주 좋은 발표를 해주신 마커스 홈즈 교수님 그리고 토론을 해주신 은용수 교수님께 소리는 안 들리겠지만 다들 뜨거운 박수를 부탁드리겠습니다. 네, 이것으로 첫 번째 오프닝 세션을 마치고요. 잠깐 조금 늦기는 했는데 잠깐 브레이크 타임을 가지고 바로 다음 세션을 준비하도록 하겠습니다. 네, 여러분 감사합니다.